If you were to go into a room full of Souls game fans and ask them what they think the worst Dark Souls game is, most of them would probably answer Dark Souls 2. If you then proceed to ask why they feel that way, they will tell you because it sucks. Well, why does it suck, you may ask? The answer? Because it's bad. And why is it bad? Because it's shit. On the other hand, those who didn't answer the initial question with Dark Souls 2 are now up in arms because their favorite game, which cured their depression, saved their family, and resurrected their dog from the dead, got insulted. When it comes to Dark Souls 2, it almost seems like you cannot simply have a normal conversation within this community. Most of the time, it's either one extreme or the other. But why is that? Why is specifically Dark Souls 2 such a divisive game that is either loved or hated? And yes, this is yet another video essay on Dark Souls 2, but you clicked on it, so you can't really complain. First things first, let's address the elephant in the room. How do I personally feel about the game? I like Dark Souls 2. I know, a brave take. But I do agree that Dark Souls 2 is the worst game in the series. To me, all of the Souls series, and as an extension of that, most of FromSoft's recent games, really just tickle the right spot in my brain, so even if I can confidently say that Dark Souls 2 is the worst in the series, I still love it way more than most other games. There is something inherent in their game design which just hooks me way more than what the rest of the AAA community is offering. And yes, I put up Rockstar's logo on screen for a reason, but that will have to wait for another video. In a sense, you could say that playing the Souls games has ruined other games for me, and I'm not the only one who's had this issue.
The appeal of Dark Souls, for me, is hard to quantify. I think I can sum it up by saying it's the best game I've ever played, and I'm 41 now. I've been playing games since I was 5 years old. Video games, and it's just the most enjoyable experience I've had playing video games, to the point that it's ruined other video games for me.
But let's take a closer look at why Dark Souls 2 is this divisive in the community, and especially why its positioning in the series as the second game has been both a blessing and a curse. And in order to do that, we have to take a look at what I believe the respective roles of the games in the series were, and why Dark Souls 2 has gotten such a bad reputation as a result. I will also mention Demon's Souls here because I think it is relevant. In 2009, Demon's Souls was a bold new direction for the studio, which ultimately paid off big time. Serving as a sort of proof of concept for what we now call the Souls games formula, it is by no means the best the series has to offer. Again, I'm counting Demon's Souls as a part of the Dark Souls series here because I think it is necessary for the narrative of this video, but it ultimately did everything it needed to do, introducing the world to this, for the time, risky game concept, as most releases followed a very safe design philosophy back then, and ultimately letting FromSoft know that they might be onto something with this game. Shuhei Yoshida, a former president of PlayStation, famously said this after playing the game before its release, and I quote, "This is crap. This is an unbelievably bad game." So the decision to only publish the game in Japan was made, since they thought it would flop anyways. But looking back at it now was, by Yoshida's own admission, a big mistake for Sony. Thanks to Atlus and Bandai Namco seeing the potential of Demon's Souls and publishing the game in the West, it was released to actually really good critical acclaim, marking the beginning of a new age for FromSoftware. With the seed of Demon's Souls firmly planted in the ground, the studio got back to work, and it didn't take long for the world to see what would become of their new creation. After 2.5 years, FromSoft was ready to release their next project, called Dark Souls. Instead of a direct sequel, this game was more of a spiritual successor to Demon's Souls, since Sony still owned the rights to the intellectual property. Dark Souls released without a crazy marketing campaign to boost its sales, yet it became a massive success mostly through word of mouth. Those who played the game and loved it just couldn't shut up about it, so it started to grow in popularity. And not only that, it also received a critical reception to match, with some citing the game to be among the greatest ever made. Critics and fans alike were praising its level design, checkpoint and death system, and obviously boss design. And a lot of people would point towards the game's director Hidetaka Miyazaki when talking about these design choices. While it was obviously the combined effort of everyone involved in the making of these games that made this success possible in the first place, there's no denying that Miyazaki's involvement didn't also play a major role for the game's good reception. He managed to create a good foundation with Demon's Souls, but Dark Souls was the game which really shaped the identity of the series. When it comes to Dark Souls 2, and what I mentioned about its role in the series earlier, they had a huge problem on their hands. Dark Souls 2 now had a lot more eyes on it as Dark Souls did prior, so the pressure was on. They knew they had the seed of something great in their hands when they made Demon's Souls. They were amazed by the reception to the sprout which they had cultivated out of that seed with Dark Souls 1. And now it was time to show the world what a beautiful plant it could possibly become with Dark Souls 2. But unfortunately, their garden had a little caterpillar problem which started slowly nibbling away at some of the plant's leaves. I know that this plant analogy is a bit bizarre, but bear with me here. With Dark Souls 2 being the second game in the series, they wanted to build on Dark Souls 1's systems while also massively iterating on new concepts and ideas, to keep it fresh and not to disappoint fans with a lackluster sequel. But it wasn't just the fans they didn't want to disappoint, as their publisher, Bandai Namco, was also breathing down their necks. After the huge success they've had with the first game, Bandai Namco immediately greenlit the making of 2 sequels in order to capitalize on this new niche they had created. But that also meant that there were going to be some pretty tight deadlines. If you really think about it, FromSoft had a pretty crazy development pipeline going on during the 2010s. They released a total of 13 games from 2010 till 2020, with the whole Dark Souls series being released between 2011 and 2016, while also releasing Armored Core 5, Mobile Suit Gundam Unicorn, Steel Battalion Heavy Armor, Armored Core Verdict Day, Bloodborne, and of course Dark Souls 2 Scholar of the First Sin, between the first and third installments of the series. They had all these different projects going on at the studio, basically having to work on multiple projects at the same time. So a decision had to be made. While Miyazaki, the guy who has gotten most of the credit for the recent success, was still at work on the Authorities of the Abyss DLC, and later Bloodborne, someone else had to take over the reins for the Dark Souls 2 project. And that someone was Tomohiro Shibuya. And he had big plans for the game. As I've said earlier, he didn't want to just create an ordinary sequel, so the initial scope of the game, when development began, was pretty crazy. Shibuya wanted to create an expansive, open world, while offering major graphical improvements over the first game. And all of this was to be made within a brand new engine. Oh boy, here we go. So the team working on Dark Souls 2 had to first develop a completely new engine from scratch, as the engine they used to make the first Dark Souls wouldn't have been able to fully deliver on their vision for the game. Then they had to create an interesting and varied open world for players to explore within the context of the Souls game formula, while making it look very pretty for the PS3 and Xbox 360 consoles, within a 3-year time span, while having multiple game projects happening at the studio at the same time, and I could go on, but it's getting pretty old at this point. Let's quickly sum up how the rest of Dark Souls 2's development went. As you could expect, the team soon started to face some pretty major problems. The scope was too great for the amount of time they had to work on this game, not to mention the technical difficulties that would come from creating a new engine and optimizing this huge game for the, at the time, current generation of consoles, which were very close to the end of their life cycle. Somewhere around halfway through the development, upper management at FromSoft had to make another decision, as they became aware of the fact that the game wasn't going to be ready in time if things stayed like they were. So Tomohiro Shibuya was relieved of his duties as the director of the project, and Yui Tanimura was appointed to clean up this mess. The latter half of the game's development time was mostly spent reassembling the different pieces that had been created by the team into a somewhat coherent product. The open world was scratched and they settled for a more traditional world structure like the first Dark Souls had. The graphical fidelity and especially the lighting system had to be downgraded in order to eliminate the performance issues on consoles. And in the end, the game turned out to be way closer to the original Dark Souls than the team had hoped, while still retaining a few changes to distinguish itself from its predecessor. Now, we have finally arrived at the part of the video where we point our fingers at Dark Souls 2's issues, as well as its strengths. And to do that, why don't we check out the game's critical reception, because surely a game with development troubles like this can't possibly have been received well. Now that is surprising. Somehow, after everything that has happened, they still managed to pull it together. These scores do not look like a game with big troubles during development, but more like a pretty damn good product. So what's all the fuss in the community about when it comes to this game? Let's start off with what I believe to be Dark Souls 2's biggest weaknesses. First and foremost, the biggest issue that I have found in this game is its combat feel. The way combat works on paper is almost identical between the two games. However, there are some key differences in how it actually feels to control your character. In general, I would describe Dark Souls 2's combat as more sluggish and not as snappy as the previous title, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, as there are games that utilize a slower and more deliberate combat to create a satisfying weight to all of your actions, like my other favorite game series, Monster Hunter. In Monster Hunter, you will usually be locked into certain animations once you've initiated them, so positioning and timing is key in that series. The character's movement is also different, as you can't do a zero inertia turn, basically just instantly snapping around. And Dark Souls 2 seems to have some similarities here, but it just doesn't end up feeling quite right in the context of the Souls game's combat system. It almost feels like they tried to smooth out the movements of your character in an attempt to make it more realistic, but it just ends up feeling almost unresponsive at times. Coupled with a lack of feedback when being hit in many instances, it creates this floaty feel to everything, like you're never really fully in control of your character. Now, I realize that I'm making this combat system sound really bad here, when in reality, I love Dark Souls 2 regardless. But I've always wondered why the game just seemed to feel worse to play than the first and third games in the series, so I try to accurately portray it here. All of this is probably a result of them using a new engine, as well as the newly added adaptability stat for your character, which can increase the amount of iframes you get when rolling, among other things. For someone whose first experience with the Souls series was Dark Souls 2, many of these issues I will be mentioning here probably don't bother you, as you had no point of reference to the rest of the series. And that seems to be a common link between those who go to hell and back for Dark Souls 2, since most of them had their first experience with the second entrance in the series. So I can totally understand people who disagree with me here, but if you can hear me out until the end, you should be able to understand where I'm coming from. Let's move on from the combat and have a look at Dark Souls 2's second biggest problem, the world and level design. As a direct result of the problematic development of the game, its world feels disconnected, maybe even random at times. I always had a hard time trying to make a mental map of the world, as the different levels just seemed to mix together in weird ways. As I'm sure all of us remember the infamous Earthern Peak to Iron Keep transition, taking a very innocuous looking elevator in the middle of a large building with very little in the form of landmarks around it, just to end up in a lava-filled hellscape. This brings back memories. There are various examples of shenanigans like this happening when going between zones. But it most definitely is not all bad. There are also times where you see a large and interesting landmark in the background, only to wind up in that exact location. When the world design in Dark Souls 2 works, it just works. When it doesn't, it feels very jarring and random. This also extends to the levels themselves. You will hardly find any of the jaw-dropping shortcuts you would find in the previous game, which is something a lot of people really enjoyed and played a big role in the success of the first Dark Souls. Strangely enough, I believe that you could compare Dark Souls 2's world design to the second half of Dark Souls, which is widely regarded as some of the worst level design found in that game. It also managed to feel strangely disconnected from the rest of the game. While the first half was insanely dense with shortcuts and paths linking together and looping back around to places you have been to previously, the second half was just there. You would go to a place, do it, and teleport over to the next. And we do not talk about Lost Izalith here. But like I've said, Dark Souls 2 also has its upsides when it comes to its world design. Here, the fact that it was originally supposed to be an expansive open world game actually helps it out massively when it comes to the variety in the environments. Over the course of your playthrough, you will visit incredibly diverse environments in a way the first Dark Souls was never really able to achieve. This means you will probably always be surprised at what kind of a landscape you will find next, which will make going through the game pretty exciting. But this diversity comes at the cost of not having much consistency to its world. Ultimately, what you prefer is completely up to you, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. And finally, we have arrived at the last major issue that I could find in Dark Souls 2, which is enemy and boss encounter design. And yes, I am talking about both the OG Dark Souls 2 as well as Scholar of the First Sin. While there aren't many differences with the bosses, the enemy encounters within levels have been significantly changed in Scholar of the First Sin, and in my opinion, usually for the worse. But it is still a core issue even with the original game. So what am I talking about here? Dark Souls 2 simply had way less memorable and interesting enemy encounters. While there are a few good ones, I can barely remember most of the enemy placements in the game, as they just seem to be placed without too much care or thought put into them. While on the other hand, I can still remember most enemy placements and fun memories I had fighting them in Dark Souls 1, even though I'm pretty sure that I've played Dark Souls 2 a lot more than the first game. And sadly, this also extends to the bosses, which are mostly what the Souls series is known for. I don't think that I've mentioned it yet, but Dark Souls 2 has got a lot of content, way more than the previous game, and that doesn't really work in its favor when it comes to the bosses. Yes, it has some amazing fights, Sir Alon, the Fume Knight, the Burned Ivory King, etc., that are both impressive mechanically and visually, but they are just so few and far between that it really impacts the experience. This game has many bosses which are mediocre or okay at best, and sadly a decent amount of bosses which I wouldn't even have classified as a boss in the first place, or just find a nuisance with no real joy to fighting them. You know, your Covetous Demon, the Flexol Sentry, the Royal Rat Vanguard, Skeleton Lords. I don't really know why they had to bring that back for Dark Souls 3. The Guardian Dragon. Look at how they massacred my boy. And of course, Prowling Mages and Congregation. Just to name a few. These bosses added very little in terms of value to their respective areas.
You don't even need to dodge, just do damage. What the
Well, by mostly being boring, and just sort of ended up disappointing me when it was finally time to fight them, as some of the areas they were placed in actually were pretty enjoyable to play through. In conclusion, Dark Souls 2's enemies and bosses were really hit or miss and didn't manage to even match the bar that Dark Souls had set previously. Okay, that was a very depressing segment, and this video is starting to drag on quite a bit, so why don't we finish this off by looking at the good stuff Dark Souls 2 introduced. Like I've said before, we got some really nice and varied environments in the game, or at the very least, to a greater degree in the previous title. Same thing applies to the weapon and build variety you could go for. Since the game had a lot more content, there was more cool stuff to use, which also made subsequent playthroughs more interesting. Magic and pyromancy was vastly improved, even going so far as to add a completely new type of magic called hexes. In my last Dark Souls 2 playthrough, which I streamed here on the channel, I actually went for my first ever magic build in the Dark Souls games, and I had a lot of fun with it. But I think I will stick to my trusty slab of sharp iron for the foreseeable future. Another thing which was really popular in Dark Souls 2 were PvP fight clubs. They have always existed, but a greater amount of build variety just created a way bigger active PvP community. And who could forget the good old days of Iron Key Bridge PvP?
I think the multiplayer choices they're making with Dark Souls 2 are really smart, and I think it will make the online side of it flourish.
I always liked this style of online because it wasn't intrusive. You could avoid it, but you can also get invaded, and there's a lot of surprises going on with this game.
I like the sense that other people are running this gauntlet with you in parallel, and it feels like they're in a parallel universe. I like the idea that I can see someone's death, and that gives me a heads up by touching the bloodstain.
And even if I had some pretty mean things to say, Dark Souls 2 still had some good ideas when it came to its combat, namely the power stancing system, which basically unlocks a whole new moveset for your weapons if you use 2 of the same type while having about 1.5 times the required dexterity and strength needed to wield those weapons. This alone can make your build so much more interesting, and pretty much everyone agrees that this was a great change to the combat. And you've probably noticed by now that I haven't said anything about the story or the characters in the game. And that's because I'm having a really hard time trying to evaluate these things, and I came to the conclusion that it's best to leave those things out, as rating those is way out of my skill set. And I also do believe that these aspects are more like the cherry on top of these games, so I will just leave you alone with your own thoughts about the matter. Now it is time to finally loop back around to the weird plant analogy from earlier, and also the questions I posed at the start of this video. Why is this game so divisive, even if the game was received very well all around? Well, I think it simply comes down to the fact that the game was simply more popular. Few people really cared about Demon's Souls, the game which planted the seeds for the series. As those seeds began to sprout with Dark Souls, people really got to see the potential of this franchise, and it became a lot more popular. After a very bug-infested period in which that sprout grew up to become a small plant, those who originally became interested in these games were put off by how different certain things were, thanks to those little caterpillars eating away at the leaves and twisting what would become Dark Souls 2. This new game would receive massive amounts of new players which hadn't played the previous games, which meant you had 2 different parts of the community. Those who were accustomed to the way Dark Souls 1 did things, and those who only knew Dark Souls 2 as their first experience, creating a rift within the player base. And as we all know, the first experience you have with something is usually the most impactful one. But at the end of the day, a caterpillar will one day turn into a butterfly, and a plant will always heal itself in order to finally bloom into what it was truly destined to be. And if you can't tell what I mean by that, I'm saying that Dark Souls 3 is the best of the bunch. Fuck, this video wasn't supposed to be this long. I thought I'd do a quick interlude video about Dark Souls 2 between my Armored Core videos, but it just kinda went up in scope the longer I kept working on it. But thanks to this recent poll I did on the channel's community tab, go check there periodically, by the way, I will be doing some polls there and stuff, so I now know that you guys don't mind the longer form content. So I guess this is fine. Also, go check out the description of this video. I will have a bunch of my sources for information I used in this video linked down there, as well as other videos I used to get inspiration. The video on what happened to Dark Souls 2 by Matt McMuscles gave me a good initial idea on how Dark Souls 2's development went, so definitely check it out for yourself if you want to know more. Also, I think at this point you're able to tell that my narration has progressively gotten worse throughout the video, which I shouldn't probably do this long of a video that often, but we'll see what happens. Anyways, I hope I was properly able to bring across the points in this video. As it started to get bigger, I might have lost sight of what I actually wanted to say in some segments. So definitely call me out on stuff I did poorly down in the comments. But that's gonna be it. I really hope you enjoy watching this video, and maybe drop me a like, or maybe even subscribe if you're feeling brave enough. The next video is going to be on why Armored Core Master of Arena is so damn good. But until then, stay safe, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.